Welcome to the most important sermon. I'm your host, Chester Stanley.
And I'm your co-host, Robin Stanley, and wife of Chester. And we'd like to welcome to the program Pastor David McKibben. David, it's really good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Very good. David, we would like to just explore initially a little in terms of who you are as a person, where you've come from, your background in terms of journey to ministry.
Yeah.
I detect a bit of an accent there. Tell us about where you were born.
Yes, I was born and brought up in Northern Ireland.
Okay.
Yeah, my father was a farmer and born and brought up on a small farm about 15 miles south of Belfast.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Okay, just a tiny little Irish village, I suppose.
Yeah. Now in Australia, I hear of properties, thousands of acres. Well, our farm was 42 acres.
42 acres, yes. Okay.
Which is a fairly average size of a farm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're brought up in this farm. You go to school in the district.
A little country primary school.
Yes.
About 30 pupils in the whole school.
Amazing.
And then a high school. About 12 in a town about 12 miles. Well, actually Downpatrick, associated with St. Patrick.
Okay.
If I had a dollar for every time I'd passed by his grave, I'd be quite well off. Yeah. So so that's.
And sorry.
I was going to say, David, Ireland's an interesting place in terms of religion.
Yes.
And just have a question, what is your background in terms of your religious and Christian experience?
Sure. I was brought up in a Christian home. My father and mother were both Presbyterians.
Okay.
But they were making the transition towards Adventism when I was about 6 or 7 years of age. So most of my memories of church are of the Adventist church, and for me, my home church was in Belfast. We had to travel about 12 miles to the nearest Adventist church.
So you went there with your family each Sabbath and worshipped together?
That's right. Yeah. And for my father, it was quite a transition. He was an elder in a Presbyterian church, so it was quite a decision for him. Because I think the family background going back is Presbyterian for many generations.
Really?
Which would be true in Ireland in general.
Yes,
I'm strong traditions.
Yes.
So it was quite a challenge.
A big change. And a big decision to make.
Very much
for
so.
Sure.
Very much so. Yeah.
And so you went to high school,
yes.
David, in the area, and what did you do after high school?
Okay, after high school, I wasn't really sure what to do, and I ended up in the public service. So I worked in the public service for about 11 years. That was quite an interesting job. I worked in a number of different departments. Probably the department I enjoyed most was actually as a reporter for the Northern Ireland Assembly, like a parliamentary reporter. Really enjoyed that.
So you sat in the chamber?
Sat in the chamber, listened to debates. Yeah, listened to debates. And I enjoyed them, given what I'm doing now, but I enjoy words. And there's a tremendous power towards the spoken word.
Yes, absolutely.
And we did debates, or we edited the debates, and made sure they were as accurate as possible. But when you actually heard them, that made a difference. There'll always be a place, I think, for the spoken word.
Yes, David, I'm utterly convinced that you Irish people have an additional gene that somehow gives you this enormous eloquence with words. I don't know if you have a comment in relation to that.
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. I think we do seem to have a reputation for the gift of speech. Certainly in terms of English literature, Irish people have contributed a lot.
Yes.
I think sometimes we have a certain way with words, a certain logic, the way we express it. It makes sense with us. It seems to cause a lot of fun on the part of those who hear us.
Yes.
I know
the Irish jokes, etc.
All of that. And I know even, even now when I'm preaching to my congregation, I sometimes see a smile. I don't think I've said anything funny, but perhaps it's the way I've said it, or the way the way I've expressed it.
Fascinating. So you've got this great job right there in the chamber of the Parliament. You're doing your work there. What happened after that?
Well, unfortunately, what happened there was that that job was subject to the twists and turns of life in Northern Ireland. That assembly was dissolved by the British Parliament. They felt that it wasn't achieving anything. So that meant I had to leave that job and be transferred to another department, which I didn't enjoy so much.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
David, you know, there's lots of joy and laughter and literature and in Ireland, but there's also been some very traumatic things. Has there been anything that's impacted on your life in terms of the conflict that exists,
Sure.
that has existed there in the past?
Sure.
Yeah.
The civil unrest, and at home we often refer to it as the Troubles, which is an understatement.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
They broke out when I was 10 years of age. So I don't really have many memories of what it was like before that. And that lasted, lasted nearly for 30 years. Okay. And you know, during that time, small country, just about everybody was impacted by it. The closest impact it had on me personally was my sister's father-in-law was murdered by the IRA. He was a policeman. A good friend at school, he survived a murder attempt. So it did impact in that way.
Yes.
And though my memories of those years are still actually very happy and positive, you were affected by it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah. And did that have any impact on your spiritual journey at all?
It certainly did, Robin. I can remember the night that my father told me about the murder of my sister's father-in-law.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And in the months that followed, had a tremendous struggle there with the concept of forgiveness.
Yes.
Because I certainly didn't feel forgiveness towards his murderers.
Yes.
And then just a few months after that happened, we had an incident, a bombing at a Remembrance Day parade. You may remember it, where 11 people were killed.
Oh, yes.
And a man called Gordon Wilson, he lost his daughter in the bombing.
Yes.
Right.
And the day after the tragedy, he appeared on national television to say that the previous night, he had prayed a prayer of forgiveness for the people who had killed his daughter. Because as a Christian, he remembered the words of Jesus, you know, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Yes.
And that had a profound impact on me personally, because I realised that, well, if he could forgive, then, yeah.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff.
Yeah, very powerful.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll explore this further, David. This is a wonderful and moving story. So stay with us, and we will be right back.
Welcome back. We're talking to Pastor David McKibben, and David has been sharing with us a very poignant thought that he's been struggling with the concept of forgiveness in a very significant situation in his life. David, can you continue the story, please?
Sure, sure. As I say, I was deeply moved by the testimony of this father who had lost his daughter, how he on national television, he said that he had prayed the previous evening for their forgiveness.
Yes.
And there was another very powerful incident arising from that tragedy as well. The headmaster of the local high school, he was left in a coma as a result of that bombing.
Yes.
Never recovered consciousness.
Yes.
And his wife again appeared on television and said that she forgave the people who had done that to her husband. He actually lay in a coma for another 13 years before he passed away.
Wow.
Amazing.
But she remained, just radiated forgiveness throughout that.
That's just a tremendous thing,
Just
isn't
fantastic.
It? Yes.
I think sometimes forgiveness can be presented in a very theoretical.
Theoretical.
To me, I guess, having been born and brought up in Northern Ireland, I've seen what forgiveness can do.
Yes.
I've also seen, sadly, the results when forgiveness does not operate,
Yes.
where it's, you know, it's tit for tat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, dreadful.
Yeah, it's very moving stuff, David. Incredible to have that sort of background. At what sort of age were you when this happened, when these reports came?
Okay, I was actually in my late 20s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, get hopefully reasonably mature at that stage.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But there had been quite a few instances, you know, before that.
Yes.
Yeah.
And David, can I ask, you know, did you find it in your heart to forgive? I mean, how did you come to that place of forgiveness yourself?
I think I sort of can distinctly remember one night, you know, praying just for this, the Spirit to forgive.
Yes.
Didn't feel like it, but I just want just to express that willingness to forgive.
Yes.
Yeah. And hopefully I've sort of moved on from there.
No doubt there's pain and scars, you know.
Still.
Yes, because it was a terrible situation.
That's right.
But
because I have a nephew who was named after his grandfather, and you know, so there's always that sort of memory.
Yes,
but then that's been true for other people who have been hurt in this conflict, as in other conflicts.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
And David, did that impact on any decisions for the future for you?
Oh, good question. It wasn't actually long after that incident that I guess I would have to say it was sort of my call to ministry.
Okay.
You know, the Belfast church members were very, very supportive to me. I got involved in church life. I actually did some lay preaching. And probably, I'd have to be honest and say to you, probably the Lord had been calling me to ministry for quite a long time.
Okay.
Probably talking in a conversational tone of voice like you and I are now.
Yes.
But I wasn't really listening.
Yes, right.
I would love to say to you that my response was like Isaiah, oh, here I am, Lord, send me, but it was more like Jonah. Because I guess when your country's under attack, there's a tremendous sense of loyalty.
Yes.
And I did not want to leave Northern Ireland to go and train for the ministry at Newbold College in England.
Yes.
I thought, oh, no, I can't do that.
No.
And but one night I was at an interdenominational gathering, about 600 young people present, and the person who spoke that night, he might as well have just been speaking to me.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I think at that stage God was shouting to me and saying, David, look, I've been talking to you about serving me in this way.
Yes.
But he was actually shouting then, saying, look,
Yes.
I really want you to go.
Yes.
Wow.
This is what I want you to do.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And your response to that?
My response was, yes. Finally, I stopped being stubborn in that particular instance, and I surrendered. Yeah. So and so with about maybe 18 months later, so I started training for the ministry.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So in terms of your background, your spiritual formation was just a solid, steady journey. You'd always been to church. You'd always been involved in church.
It was a very natural thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
No great blinding lights. No, nothing like that.
Yes.
Though, as I say, that particular night, I feel that God was speaking to me through that individual.
Sure.
But it was a very gradual sort of experience.
Well, that's a wonderful and very moving story. We'd like to go on. You don't have your wife with you here, and I think my contact with Jenny, she has an Aussie accent.
That's right.
So come on, you need to share with us. How did that happen?
That's right. Well, Robin asked the question about my response to that particular incident. Just about that time, I'd actually started writing to Jenny. As you rightly point out, Jenny's originally from Australia, from Sydney, but she was actually living and working in England at that time.
Okay.
And we were introduced by a mutual friend. We were pen pals. We started writing to each other.
Okay. Excuse me, this is while you were studying in England?
No, I was still actually living and working in Northern Ireland at that time.
And somebody introduced you.
That's right. Very quickly, she was a friend who had gone over to study at Newbold College, and just before she got married, she wrote to me inviting me to her wedding. And at the end of the letter, she wrote a P.S. I've got a friend from Australia.
Okay.
And
so
she'd be interested.
Met them via writing.
That's right.
Not in person.
Right. Not in person.
Yes.
Not in person. And so we wrote to each other, and yeah, well, I still am quite a shy person, and at that time very shy in terms of talking to girls.
Yes,
but
exactly.
in a letter it was easier. And
It was a kind approach.
it was. And so after a few months, I invited Jenny to come over and visit in Northern Ireland. And yeah, things
Just went
moved.
from there.
Just things went from there.
Fabulous. Excellent.
Yeah.
And David, following that, you went off to Newbold College, Chester said. Is that a part of your experience, obviously?
That's right.
Yep.
Jenny and I got married in June of 1989. And 3 months later, I started training for the ministry at Newbold. So that was quite a year of change.
Yes.
So you married here in Australia, or?
We actually married in the UK.
Okay.
Yes. But we came out to Australia for an extended honeymoon, and we had a sort of another wedding reception here in Australia.
Lovely.
Oh, that's delightful.
Yeah.
It would have been great if Jenny had been here, but it's nice to know the background to that story.
Yeah, thank you.
So thanks very much for that, David, and we will continue with this fascinating journey with David, so be right back. Welcome back, and we're talking with Pastor David McKibben and learning about his interesting journey. Let's just recap just very briefly, David. You marry this Aussie girl.
Yep.
You come out here to Australia. You have an extended honeymoon.
Yes.
Was that your first trip to Australia?
Oh yes, yeah.
What do you mean? Oh yes.
Yeah. Look, I'd never had any dreams of ever coming to Australia.
Yes.
Yeah. Never
Yes.
thought that would happen.
I mean, for an Irish person, the other side of the world, you know. And,
Well, most Irish people would have relatives here. You know, there's that
okay,
quite strong
that's
connection. And I did
true.
have an uncle who lived in Australia, but the thought of going to Australia, no, it never crossed my mind.
Yes.
So I see these pictures of just the green fields of Ireland.
Yes.
And you came, what were your first impressions of this?
Well, my first trip to Australia was actually during the Australian winter.
Okay.
So the thing that struck me was how warm it was. You know, if this is what the winter's like, oh my,
Yes.
what must the summers be like?
Yeah.
But it was actually quite green. You know, we went to Sydney, travelled
Yes.
along the east coast a bit.
Yes.
The distances were quite something.
Yes.
You know, I remember travelling one day and thinking to myself, I've travelled almost 2/3 the length of Ireland today, and would never have done that had it been at home.
Yes,
You know, we'd have stopped
absolutely.
somewhere for the night.
Yes.
And David, there's been a gap of time between the first visit to Australia. Just tell us briefly what transpired between Newbold and coming to Australia to minister.
Okay. Spent 6 years at Newbold.
Yeah.
Did my BA and then followed up with a master's right away. And then our first assignment was to the town of Crieff in Scotland.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
very beautiful area,
Yes.
foothills of
Yes.
the Scottish mountains. And very lovely, Scotland, a very, very lovely area in which to live and work. And we spent about 3 years there. And, you know, Jenny had mentioned that, you know, Australia's a lovely place to bring up kids.
Yes. Okay.
And by that time we had 2 children, 2 boys.
Okay.
And she's sort of, you know, kept mentioning this.
Yeah.
And so on a trip to Australia, I made a few inquiries about the possibility of coming here, and they were fairly positive in the responses. And so we got in touch and said, look, we'd be happy to come out if there's a position for us. And
you were called to New South Wales.
that's right.
Yes.
That's right. Yes, to the
Okay.
Central Coast, just north of Sydney.
And that would have been great for Jenny, because if I remember correctly, her parents were doctors in the Sydney area,
You're right.
weren't they? For most, she was probably brought up in Sydney.
You're right. So it was it was wonderful to living out of Sydney, but actually quite, you know, close enough to
Yes,
family
for
as
sure.
well. So we just felt you know, the doors had been opened up for us.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah, and things, the process worked so well. Obviously, there's no problems. Jenny coming back to our homeland. Our 2 boys had got citizenship through their mother. The only problem was, would I be allowed into Australia?
Yes. Okay.
And it was quite thorough. but
Yes.
it went very, very smoothly.
Very good.
Yeah, yeah.
So David, you've been in ministry for some years now. Is there any particular passion that you have as a minister, or do you like, you know, you might have a broad focus in your ministry?
To me, there are two things that I like to emphasise in my ministry. One is the pastoral nature of visiting.
Yes.
I believe it's very important to get to know people, and I have enjoyed very much visiting in people's homes, getting to know them, getting to know about their lives, and hopes and dreams, and so on.
Yeah.
And then the other is the preaching of the word.
Yes.
I derive tremendous blessing and satisfaction from studying and hopefully ministering the word in a practical way. So those are the two things that I particularly enjoy about ministry.
Fascinating. So David, you have worked in New South Wales, and now currently you're a pastor where?
In Adelaide, in South Australia.
Yes, right.
Yeah, so I worked almost 7 years in the Central Coast, and then received a call to come to Adelaide.
And been any challenges in terms of being a pastor in Australia? I guess hear very positive reports about you as a pastor.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
I think people are probably the same anywhere you go.
Yes.
What I appreciate about Australians is, you know, very, very, very straightforward, very upfront.
Yes.
I've enjoyed this. This took a little bit of getting used to, that if people like you, they make fun of you. They have a joke at your expense. And so there's a lot of funny stories in relation to that.
Yes.
But no, I find that people generally have been very supportive, very, very, very fair, very affirming. Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
Were you telling me earlier about you were asked to give a lecture at a college about? Just tell us about that.
Yes.
Very briefly.
When I was on the East Coast, one of the lecturers at Avondale College asked me to come and talk to the students about on the subject, what I wish they had taught me in college.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
And a few things that I can remember from that was that I talked about the importance of boundaries. You know, we're not really taught a lot about that. Well, maybe it's different now.
Yes.
But sometimes it's very different to make a distinction between the personal and the professional.
Yes.
You know, and it's important to have those limits for your family, home life, and so on. Another thing, I was aware of this, but it's only as I've got into ministry I've realised even more the brokenness of human nature.
Yes.
And inevitably you're dealing with people, and it's quite a challenge to try and minister as effectively as possible to people whose dreams or hopes are shattered in some way. And then another point was to remember that we are human beings and not human doings.
Okay.
That you can
right.
that the important thing is to actually spend time with Jesus.
Yes.
It's not so much what you do; it's who you are.
Yes.
And that
excellent.
Yeah.
Points.
Yeah. So those are just some of the things that. Yeah.
But overall, David, the impression I get is of a pastor who loves people, loves the Word. And do you enjoy being a Seventh-day Adventist pastor and minister?
It's a privilege. It's a privilege.
That's fantastic.
It's an honour to serve in that way. Yeah.
We're going to listen to you preach, and being Irish, it'll be very, very good. Tell us what you're going to preach about, just very briefly, and what is the title of your sermon?
There's a lot of talk about relevance.
Yes.
And I know when I'm preparing a sermon, I like to keep asking myself the question, so what? And so the sermon I've chosen concentrates on the parable of the talents.
The parable of the talents.
And how the message of Jesus relates in a very powerful, practical way to everyday life.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a real privilege to be with David today. And God bless you as you preach.
Thank you. The doctrine of the second coming of Jesus is a profoundly practical teaching that impacts upon life in the here and now. When Jesus spoke about this subject, he did so not to strengthen or not to satisfy curiosity, but to strengthen confidence in his word, in his promises, and to stimulate a spirit of commitment to meet the challenges of everyday life. The New Testament commentator Bruce Milne, in his book The End of the World, makes this point. This is something which is a consistent feature of all the Bible's teaching about last day events. It is always moral teaching. It is concerned with the way we are to live in the light of the return of Jesus. What really matters is how we live here and now in light of the fact that God's judgments are abroad in history and that Christ is coming again in glory. The question of the precise time of the coming of Jesus was not the primary thing for him. The primary thing was and remains, how does all this relate to my life and my conduct today? Matthew chapters 24 and 25 contain Jesus' most comprehensive teaching on this subject. That evening on the Mount of Olives, when he was speaking to his disciples, he told them about the signs that would characterize each generation of the Christian era. And then he went on to give an outline of the conditions that would prevail on the earth just prior to his return. Flowing on from that, he told a series of parables that illustrate how his followers should wait in anticipation of his return. The parable of the faithful and unfaithful servant emphasized the importance of watching expectantly. The theme of the parable of the 10 virgins is that of waiting patiently. The emphasis in the parable of the talents is one of working diligently. And finally, the parable of the sheep and the goats deals with the issue of witnessing faithfully. So watching, waiting, working, witnessing. A proper balance of these four perspectives is the appropriate way in which to wait for the return of Jesus, and is totally in line with his teaching on the subject. Today, I'd like to concentrate on that story which we know as the parable of the talents. The emphasis of this story is diligent working, of faithful stewardship. It's a story of responsibilities and responses, of assignments and attributes. Let's look at what the Bible has to say on this subject. Matthew 25 and beginning at verse 14. Again, it will be like a man going on a journey, who called his servants and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents of money, to another 2 talents, and to another 1 talent, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The scenario described in these verses was commonplace in the world of the first century. The world of the New Testament was a world of travel. It was commonplace for people of property and standing to go on long journeys. In entrusting his property to his servants, the landowner in this story was fulfilling a twin purpose. He was ensuring that his land wouldn't lie idle during his absence, and he was also testing his servants in anticipation of entrusting them with greater responsibilities. The servants were given talents. A talent was not a unit of currency, but a measurement of weight. Its value was determined by the commodity in question, whether it was gold or silver or copper. But either way, we're talking about a lot of money. We're talking about a very significant responsibility that was entrusted to each of the servants. It's also noteworthy that these people were not labourers as we commonly understand the word, but they were actually very able and skilled personnel. They would probably equate to middle level or upper level management in a modern corporation or business. The imagery that's described in these verses is very clear. The landowner represents Jesus. The duration of his journey stands for the period between his ascension into heaven and his return to this earth. And as for the talents, They represent a wide range of spiritual opportunities, privileges and resources, including natural abilities, spiritual gifts, material things, and other blessings that God has given to us as stewards. The call to account that we come to later on represents that day of final judgment, when we will be called to account for the way in which we have used the resources that God has given us. This part of the parable tells us some very important lessons about the way in which God relates to each one of us. First of all, it demonstrates God's trust in each of us. The landowner in this parable entrusted his servants with his goods. He didn't merely ask them to look after them, he gave them the authority to manage them. And he gave them the freedom to do with these things as they wanted to. Once he had done this, he didn't stand over them, he didn't look over their shoulders, he didn't check up on them. They were free to do what they wished with those talents. No interference, complete freedom. And in a sense, that's the way that God relates to each one of us. He's blessed us with various talents and resources. In his word, he has provided guidance so that we can use these resources well and live life to the full. But we have the freedom either to accept or reject his advice. God trusts us. This part of the parable also illustrates God's thoughtfulness. These servants were given responsibilities in keeping with their ability. In other words, the landowner knew his servants so well that he knew what they could cope with and what they couldn't cope with. He had a really good knowledge of them. And again, that's a marvelous picture of the way in which God relates to us. He knows us through and through. He knows each one of us better than we know ourselves. He knows what we can cope with, what would be too much. He has equipped us in line with our capacity to cope and in a way that we can meet the challenges of everyday life. And then lastly, this part of the parable illustrates God's tenderness. Now here we're going a step ahead in the story, but you'll find that later on in the story that the master, the landowner, was fair in his expectations of his servants. For example, he didn't expect a return of 5 talents from the servant to whom he had only entrusted 2 talents. The master was fair in his expectations. And again, that is a picture of God in relation to us. He is fair in terms of his expectations of us. My wife Jenny and I have 2 sons, Luke and Nathan. And our youngest son, Nathan, has learning difficulties. During the course of his life, he has gone to many different appointments, seen different psychologists and speech therapists, for example. And my wife and I can remember on one occasion, one of the people who was looking after Nathan at the time said that he would judge Nathan's progress by Nathan, that he wouldn't compare him with his peers. He would judge Nathan's progress by Nathan. And in a sense, that's the way that God relates to each one of us. He's aware of our background. He knows our circumstances. He's aware of the advantages and the disadvantages we have. He's aware of the constraints under which we operate. He's aware of all these things. And he is fair in his expectations of us. As we find in the parable, this master was impartial, he was fair, he was generous in his approval and praise. And that is a beautiful picture of God in relation to us. So all of these servants received responsibilities. Let's move on to their responses to the assignments that they had been given. Matthew 25 and verse 16. The man who had received the 5 talents went at once and put his money to work and gained 5 more. So also the one with the 2 talents gained 2 more. And then on to verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received the 5 talents brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 talents. See, I've gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. The man with the 2 talents also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 talents. See, I've gained 2 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Each of these servants responded with activity. Their response can be summarized in that one word, activity. In each case, they made a return of 100%. A marvelous result, a fantastic outcome. How did that happen? Well, let me make these suggestions. First of all, these servants displayed initiative. They showed tremendous enterprise and resourcefulness in the way in which they used the talents which they had been given. Now, no doubt there were the elements of adventure and risk in how they responded. Perhaps some of the projects that they got engaged in didn't quite work. Maybe they even failed. But because they were diligent, because they kept on displaying initiative, their successes more than outweighed their losses. I think that the response of the servants illustrates the point that's found by the wise man in Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 6. It says this, sow your seed in the morning, and at evening let not your hands be idle. For you do not know which will succeed, whether this or that, or whether both will do equally well. The servants showed tremendous initiative. They worked hard, they were diligent. You know, Thomas Edison was one of the greatest inventors that this world has ever known. And yet he encountered failure many occasions. But he kept trying, he showed initiative. And it was Thomas Edison who said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So these servants showed initiative. They also displayed involvement. The word that is used to describe their activity conveys the idea of merchants trading in the marketplace. They got involved with people. I can imagine that they were checking the stocks and shares. They were looking at commodities, what were doing well, what were faring badly, and they made adjustments as necessary. But the important thing is that they were rubbing shoulders with people. They were getting involved. They didn't keep themselves to themselves. Also, these servants displayed integrity. Because they were reliable in the little things, they produced this outstanding result. God cares about the everyday, about the little things. It is actually in the routine that our characters are developed and our lives are tested. You know, I love this quotation. Someone has said that God does not want extraordinary people who do extraordinary things nearly so much as he wants ordinary people who do ordinary things extraordinarily well. And our example in this, as in all things, is Jesus. You know, when we think of Jesus, we think about his ministry of preaching and teaching and healing. But for most of his life, he worked behind the carpenter's bench in Nazareth. Those are the quiet years, the silent years. We know very little about them. And yet we have this beautiful thought contained in the book The Desire of Ages by Ellen White, where she says that Jesus was doing God's service just as much when laboring at the carpenter's bench as when working miracles for the multitude. So these servants responded with activity. And in the same way, God wants us to be faithful, to be diligent in the everyday matters of life. We are to respond actively to the resources with which he has blessed us. In that context, I'd like to share a quotation from a speech by the late Martin Luther King Jr. This is what he said. We are challenged on every hand to work untiringly to achieve excellence in our life work. Not all men are called to specialized or professional jobs. Even fewer rise to the heights of genius in the arts and sciences. Many are called to be labourers in factories, fields and streets. But no work is insignificant. All labour that uplifts mankind has dignity and importance and should be undertaken with painstaking excellence. If a man is called to be a street sweeper, He should sweep even as Michelangelo painted, or Beethoven composed music, or Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. You know, even as I read those words, I can feel the shivers going up and down my spine. Marvelous words. And it is that what God calls us to do, to place our personal signature upon the work that we do, the life that we live, so that we may serve those people in our sphere of influence. These servants received a reward, actually the same reward, a commendation, well done, good and faithful servant. A promotion, you've been in charge of a few things, I will place you in charge of many things. And an invitation, come and share your master's happiness. The reward was the same in all instances. You see, the issue wasn't the amount. The issue was the way in which they responded. We may not be equal in ability and opportunity, but we can be equal in effort. God loves us all equally, but we're not all equal in terms of our giftedness and our opportunities. But we can be equal in our effort, in our response. And remember, God is fair in his expectation. However, the story doesn't stop there. We go on to the response of the third servant. And again, his response can be summarized in one word: apathy. Verse 18 of Matthew 25 reads, but the man who had received the 1 talent went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. This servant wasn't guilty of dishonesty, like the story of the servant, of the story of the dishonest steward. He wasn't guilty of wastefulness, like the prodigal son. He wasn't guilty of getting himself hopelessly submerged in debt, like the story of the unmerciful servant. The problem with this servant was that he didn't do anything at all. He didn't take any risks. He didn't even try. Apathy. This servant was guilty of indifference. He showed no regard for duty, no regard for the resources of his master. And when he was brought to account, he made weak excuses. Verse 24, then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talent in the ground. See, here is what belongs to you. So he recognized that it wasn't through lack of ignorance or lack of knowledge, or lack of ability that he didn't do anything. He just didn't do anything at all. And then he started to blame his master. In actual fact, he condemned himself out of his own mouth. He accused his master of being harsh and austere, when in actual fact his master had shown by his actions that he was gracious and generous. This servant was condemned not for failure, but for failure to try. He was guilty of indifference. He was also guilty of an inactivity. Didn't do anything at all. One of the Greek words that is used to translate the word sin in the Bible is the word hamartia. And it has this idea of missing the mark, of failing to be what you could be. The 19th century author Charles Lamb has a character called Samuel Legreece in one of his novels. Samuel Legreece was a young man who had tremendous potential, but sadly he failed to fulfill that promise. As he was starting out onto manhood, people were saying of him, he will do great things if he wants to. And then the years passed to middle age, and people were saying he could still do great things if he wants to. And then the years of middle age gave way to old age, and people said of him, he could have done great things if he had wanted to. Could have been, might have done. How true are those words? For all sad words of tongue and pen, the saddest are these, it might have been. and it could have been different for this servant. But he didn't do anything at all. He didn't even try. He didn't take any risks. And he was also guilty of isolation. He kept that talent to himself. In actual fact, he was so concerned about losing it that he went and buried it, which was often what people did in those days. But by burying it in the ground, it was of no use to anyone. It wasn't of any use to him, to his master, or to anyone else in his sphere of influence. He totally failed to understand the responsibilities of service. And the very thing that he feared would happen did happen. Notice how the master responded to this servant. Verse 26. His master replied, "You wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown, and gather where I have not scattered seed? Well then, you should have put my money in deposit with the bankers, so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Take the talent from him, and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. For everyone who has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has, will be taken from him." The very thing that this servant feared actually happened. And these verses illustrate a very important principle of life. Quite simply, you use it or you lose it. Use it or lose it. And that applies to so many areas of life. It applies to knowledge. You know, how many of us, and I'm one of them, learned a language at school but didn't do anything with it? And any French that I learned at school, I've basically all forgotten because I didn't carry it forward. I didn't develop it. It's true with an art or a craft or a skill. Unless we practice it, unless we develop it, we lose it. Use it or lose it. And that's the tragedy of this servant. His story is a story of wasted opportunity. He had the same chance as his fellow servants. Okay, he didn't have so many talents, but he had opportunities to use that talent, but he didn't do it. He went with the flow. He drifted along. He dodged opportunities. He shirked responsibilities. And sadly, he ended up receiving the same fate as evildoers. The parable concludes, verse 30, "And throw that worthless servant outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And so we have the responses of these 3 servants to the gifts, the talents which had been bestowed upon them. A very stark and dramatic contrast is drawn between them. 2 of the servants received words of commendation. The 3rd servant was on the receiving end of a stinging rebuke. 2 of the servants received increased responsibility. The 3rd servant lost everything that he had. 2 of the servants were ushered into the joy of their master's presence. The 3rd servant was shut out, separated from the joy of his master's presence forever. And all because of their attitudes towards opportunity. All because of the way in which they cared for the resources which had been entrusted to them. Jesus is coming soon. That's a given. That's a certainty. We're not told when he will come, how long it will be, but we know on the basis of the Bible that he is coming. Today is still a day of grace, a day of opportunity. And our response to the coming of Jesus is to be a delicate balance of watching, of waiting, of working, of witnessing, of living life to the full, of making the most of what we have. You see, this life that you and I now enjoy and experience isn't a rehearsal. This is the real thing. This is the drama, the story of your life unfolding. This life that you and I now enjoy isn't a practice session. This is the game. This is it. And so the Bible encourages us to live life to the full, to go for it. You know, we have the words of the wise man again in Ecclesiastes, who says, chapter 9, verse 10, "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For in the grave where you are going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom." So go for it. Give it your best shot. Give it 100%. And okay, such a life will involve risk, the element of risk. There will be uncertainty. There will be adventure. But that is the only way in which to live life to the full. And if we live life in such a way, we will be fulfilling the command of Jesus. Do business until I come. And that's the appeal that I would like to make to you. Live life to the full. Enjoy life at its very best. This is a wonderful gift that you and I have been given. And our best response to what Jesus has done and to the fact that he is coming again is to live that life to the full, to enjoy it, to make the most of it, to do what we can, to make the most of our talents in obedience to him. Thank you for this opportunity to share this with you. I invite you just to, let's just pray together. Father in heaven, we want to thank you for your many gifts to us. Thank you for the wonderful gift of life. Thank you for the wonderful gift of each day. Thank you for the talents, the opportunities, the resources with which you have entrusted us. And we pray that day by day that you'd help us to use these talents to the full, to make the most of the opportunities to come our way, that you might be glorified and that others might be blessed and helped and served. Help us to realize that it is really death to hide our talents, but it is life to use them in your service and for the blessing of others. So, Father in heaven, by your grace and by the power of your Spirit, help us to live this way, to live each day to your honor and glory. And we ask this in Jesus' name and for his sake. Amen.